I'm Cletus, 37 years old, a single father to my amazing 10-year-old son Ethan who has autism. Last Thanksgiving changed everything when my niece Jessica mouthed those words while my entire family laughed. They never realized I was their financial lifeline until I walked away with my son. The text from Dad about the payment reminded me how they only valued what I could give them, not who we were. Little did they know I was about to teach them the most expensive lesson of their lives. Before I share this journey, let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and hit that subscribe button if you want to see how a single decision can permanently transform family relationships when respect is thrown out the window. Growing up in a wealthy family in Boston was supposed to be a privilege, but for me, it often felt more like a burden. My parents, Martin and Eleanor Wilson, built Wilson Real Estate Developments from the ground up, turning it into a multi-million-dollar empire that dominated the New England luxury market. Their success was impressive, no doubt about that, but it came with expectations that weighed on me from an early age. While my older sister Amanda thrived in the family business atmosphere, I was always the odd one out. Where she saw dollar signs and networking opportunities, I saw computer code and technological possibilities. My parents tried to hide their disappointment, but it was obvious in the way they introduced us at business functions. "This is our daughter Amanda. She'll be taking over the company someday," followed by, "And this is Cletus. He's interested in computers." Even as a kid, I was fascinated by technology while everyone else in my family was obsessed with real estate. I'd spend hours in my room building computers from spare parts while Amanda shadowed Dad at property viewings. My parents viewed my passion as a quirky phase I'd eventually grow out of. "Computers are just toys," my father would say. "Real wealth is built on land and buildings, son." But I knew even then that the digital revolution would change everything. By the time I was in high school, the divide had grown wider. Amanda was class president, homecoming queen, and already interning at the family company during summers. I was the tech club president, building the school's first website and getting called to the principal's office not for trouble but to fix the administration's computer systems. Two different worlds, two different kinds of success, but only one that my family valued. College was my escape. While Amanda went to Harvard Business School as expected, I attended MIT against my parents' wishes. "What kind of business connections will you make there with all those nerds?" Dad had asked dismissively. But I thrived among those nerds, finally finding people who spoke my language and valued my skills. It was during my junior year that I met Sophia. She wasn't from wealth like my family, just a kind-hearted education major who wanted to teach kindergarten. She had warm brown eyes, a genuine laugh, and she looked at me like I was someone special, not someone disappointing. We married a year after graduation, much to my parents' chagrin. "A teacher?" My mother had whispered to Amanda at our wedding. "Couldn't he have found someone more suitable?" They never tried to hide these comments, assuming I wouldn't hear, or perhaps not caring if I did. When Sophia became pregnant with Ethan, we were ecstatic. I had secured a good position as an IT security specialist for a major financial firm, and Sophia was teaching at a well-regarded private school. We bought a modest but comfortable house about 45 minutes outside Boston, far enough from my family to breathe, close enough for obligatory visits. Ethan was born on a snowy January morning. 10 perfect fingers, 10 perfect toes, and eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom in the world. For the first 2 years, everything seemed typical, but gradually we noticed differences. Ethan wasn't meeting certain milestones. He rarely made eye contact. He became intensely focused on specific objects, particularly anything that spun. And when he became overwhelmed, which happened increasingly often, he would rock back and forth, humming a specific pattern of notes. The diagnosis came when he was 3, autism spectrum disorder. While Sophia and I researched everything we could about supporting Ethan, my family reacted with their usual blend of judgment and discomfort. "He just needs more discipline," Dad suggested. "Amanda's kids are perfectly normal," Mom would add helpfully, as if we had somehow failed as parents. The strain proved too much for Sophia. When Ethan was 4, she left us both. "I didn't sign up for this," were her last words to me. "I'm not strong enough for this life." I was devastated but refused to fall apart. Ethan needed me more than ever, and I was determined to be everything he needed. I threw myself into learning everything I could about autism. I attended support groups, hired specialists, adapted our home environment to better suit Ethan's needs, and adjusted my work schedule to be more present for him. What my family saw as burdens, I recognized as unique aspects of my extraordinary son. Ethan might not express love in conventional ways, but the way his whole body relaxed when I entered a room told me everything I needed to know. During those years of single parenting, I was also quietly building something my family never bothered to notice. Using my IT security expertise, I had developed proprietary security systems that major corporations were willing to pay handsomely for. What began as consulting work evolved into my own company, Secure Foundations, operating almost entirely in the background of my life. While my family assumed I was barely making ends meet as a single dad with a computer job, I was amassing wealth that would eventually surpass theirs. Not that they ever asked. At family gatherings, the conversation always centered around Amanda's latest luxury property development or her husband Brad's golf club achievements. My parents doted on their other grandchildren, Jessica and Jack, treating them to lavish gifts and exotic vacations. Ethan typically received gift cards, often for stores he would find overwhelming to visit. "When are you going to get a real job and give Ethan the life he deserves?" Dad would ask, completely unaware that my little computer business had recently secured a contract with 3 Fortune 500 companies. I never bothered correcting them. There was a strange comfort in being underestimated. It meant never having to live up to their impossible standards. As the years passed, I accepted our position in the family hierarchy. Amanda was the golden child, the worthy heir. I was the family failure who couldn't even maintain a marriage. It wasn't worth fighting anymore. I just focused on creating the best life possible for Ethan and myself, showing up at family events out of obligation rather than desire. Little did I know that everything would change on a Thanksgiving day that started like any other family obligation, but ended with a reckoning that had been years in the making. The annual Wilson family Thanksgiving gathering was a tradition as rigid as the starched napkins on my mother's formal dining table. Every year, we gathered at my parents' sprawling colonial mansion in Massachusetts, a 12,000-square-foot monument to their success, complete with an indoor pool, wine cellar, and views of the private lake that their property encompassed. For most families, Thanksgiving preparations involve cooking and cleaning. For Ethan and me, it involved days of careful planning and emotional preparation. At 10 years old, Ethan had made remarkable progress, but large social gatherings remained challenging for him. We packed his noise-canceling headphones, his favorite stress ball, and the tablet loaded with calming games. I prepared visual schedules so he would know exactly what to expect, and we practiced coping strategies for when things became overwhelming. "Remember, buddy," I told him as I helped him button his dress shirt that morning, "if things get too loud, you can squeeze my hand 3 times and we'll take a break outside." Despite the challenges these gatherings posed, Ethan was genuinely excited to see his grandparents. He had spent the previous week making them a special card, carefully drawing their house with impressive architectural detail, one of his many extraordinary abilities that my family rarely acknowledged. "Do you think Grandma will put my card on the refrigerator?" he asked, his eyes focused on adjusting his collar rather than meeting my gaze. "I'm sure she will," I lied, knowing Eleanor would likely tuck it away in a drawer, unwilling to disrupt her kitchen's magazine-perfect aesthetic. The hour-long drive to my parents' estate gave me plenty of time to reflect. We passed through increasingly affluent neighborhoods, the houses growing larger and more imposing until we reached the exclusive gated community where I had spent my childhood. The security guard recognized me and waved us through with a sympathetic smile that suggested he remembered my status as the family's black sheep. As we drove up the long, winding driveway lined with perfectly maintained maple trees, memories flooded back. That oak tree I fell from when I was 8, breaking my arm while attempting to install a homemade satellite dish. The garden shed I had converted into a rudimentary computer lab as a teenager. The stone bench where I had sat alone after countless family arguments about my future. This place held so many reminders of never quite measuring up. Amanda's Range Rover was already parked in the circular driveway, along with Brad's ostentatious Maserati. Brad had started as my father's protege at the company before marrying into the family, a perfect business merger disguised as a romance. Together, Amanda and Brad had become the power couple running daily operations at Wilson Real Estate Developments, with my parents taking increasingly ceremonial roles as they approached retirement. Ethan clutched his card tightly as we rang the doorbell. My mother answered, dressed impeccably in a cashmere sweater and pearls despite being in her own home on a holiday. "Cletus, Ethan, you're here." She air-kissed my cheek and gave Ethan an awkward pat on the shoulder, careful not to actually embrace him. Everyone's in the great room. We followed her through the marble-floored entryway into the spacious living area, where the rest of the family had gathered. My father stood by the grand piano, drink in hand, deep in conversation with Brad. They were speaking in hushed, serious tones that immediately caught my attention. "The bank is breathing down our necks," Brad murmured. "If we don't secure that cash infusion by Monday." They abruptly stopped talking when they noticed us, plastering on identical strained smiles. "Son, glad you could make it," Dad boomed with forced joviality, clapping me on the shoulder. He nodded toward Ethan but didn't address him directly. Amanda was perched on the leather sofa, scrolling through her phone with manicured nails. She glanced up briefly. "Oh good, you're on time for once," she said, as though my punctuality was a pleasant surprise. Her 15-year-old twins, Jessica and Jack, were sprawled across opposite ends of the room. Jessica, a mirror image of her mother with the same sleek blonde hair and calculating eyes, barely looked up from her phone. Jack, more reserved and thoughtful than his sister, offered a genuine smile and waved to Ethan. "Hi, Uncle Cletus." "Hi, Ethan," Jack called out. "Ethan, want to see this cool rock collection I started?" Before Ethan could respond, Jessica cut in with an exaggerated sigh. "Jack, nobody cares about your stupid rocks." The casual cruelty was so typical that no one bothered addressing it. This was the dynamic I had come to expect: subtle digs, dismissive comments, and underlying tension, all covered with a veneer of family togetherness. Throughout the afternoon, the pattern continued. When Ethan excitedly flapped his hands while describing a dinosaur documentary he loved, I caught Jessica rolling her eyes at her mother. When he needed to pace the perimeter of the room to regulate his sensory input, Brad muttered something about discipline just loudly enough for me to hear. I kept my responses measured and calm, as I always did. "Ethan is self-regulating," I explained for perhaps the 100th time. "It helps him process sensory information." "Well, it's distracting," Amanda replied with a tight smile. Jessica and Jack never needed to do that. I bit back the retort that Jessica and Jack needed plenty of other things like basic empathy and manners, and instead guided Ethan to a quieter corner where we could look at a book together. What truly caught my attention, however, was a conversation I overheard between my father and Brad when they thought I was out of earshot. I had gone to the kitchen to get Ethan a glass of water when I heard them in my father's adjacent study. "The Henderson deal falling through couldn't have come at a worse time," Brad was saying. "The investors are getting nervous, and with interest rates rising." I know," my father replied, sounding uncharacteristically defeated. "Thank God Cletus agreed to the loan. 500,000 should keep things afloat until the Riverside development comes through." I froze, glass in hand. The previous week, my father had called me with an unusual request. For the first time in my adult life, he had asked me for help, a temporary loan to address what he described as a minor cash flow issue at the company. He had been vague about the details, but emphasized it was just a formality, a short-term solution. I had agreed, partly out of curiosity, and partly because, despite everything, they were still family. The transfer was scheduled for the following day. What struck me now was the desperation in their voices. This wasn't a minor issue. This sounded like the company was in serious trouble, and they had turned to me, the family disappointment, as their financial savior. The irony might have been amusing if it wasn't so revealing of their character. For years, they had ignored my advice about diversifying their investments and embracing technology in their business model. Real estate is about handshakes and eye contact, not computers and code. My father had dismissed when I suggested creating virtual property tours 5 years ago. That technology was now standard in the industry, and competitors had gained significant market advantage. Similarly, when I had warned them about investing heavily in commercial real estate right before the pandemic, they had laughed at my concerns. "People will always need office space," Brad had said confidently. Those properties now stood largely vacant, bleeding money with each passing month. I returned to the great room, seeing my family through new eyes. They weren't just emotionally bankrupt in their treatment of Ethan and me. Their business was potentially on the verge of actual bankruptcy, and they had no idea that I knew. As we moved toward the dining room for dinner, I noticed Jessica whispering to her twin brother, then both of them glancing at Ethan with barely concealed disdain. Jack at least had the decency to look uncomfortable, but he said nothing to contradict his sister. The stage was set for what would become the most significant Thanksgiving of our lives, though not for any reason my family might have anticipated. The formal dining room in my parents' home had always intimidated me, even as a child. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, illuminating the gleaming mahogany table that could comfortably seat 20. The walls were adorned with original oil paintings of stern-looking Wilson ancestors and landscapes of properties the family had developed over generations. My mother had outdone herself with the table setting. Bone china plates rested on gold chargers, flanked by sterling silver flatware and crystal goblets. The centerpiece featured an elaborate arrangement of autumnal flowers, gourds, and candles that must have cost more than what many families would spend on their entire Thanksgiving dinner. Ethan immediately tensed as we entered the room. The flickering candlelight, the excessive table settings, the echoing acoustics all created a sensory minefield for him. I gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Remember our strategy," I whispered. "Count to 10 if it gets overwhelming, and focus on one thing at a time." He nodded, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his shirt. I had requested we be seated near an exit in case Ethan needed a break, but instead found our place cards positioned directly under the largest chandelier, with Ethan sandwiched between Amanda and Jessica, the two least accommodating members of the family. "Mom," I said quietly, "would it be possible to switch our seats to somewhere a bit quieter?" The chandelier might be too much for Ethan. Eleanor glanced around the table with visible annoyance. "Everything is arranged perfectly for proper dinner conversation, Cletus. Perhaps if Ethan had more exposure to formal settings, he would adjust better." The implication that Ethan's sensory processing issues could be fixed with more exposure stung, but I swallowed my frustration and helped Ethan into his assigned seat, quietly moving his water glass away from the edge and placing his stress ball within easy reach. As everyone settled in, Dad stood to carve the turkey with theatrical flourish. "Before we begin, I want to toast to another successful year for Wilson Real Estate Developments," he announced, conveniently ignoring what I had overheard about their financial troubles. "This year, under Amanda and Brad's leadership, we closed on the Harborview Tower project and broke ground on Riverside Estates." Glasses clinked around the table as everyone except Ethan and me participated in the toast. Ethan was focused on carefully arranging his silverware in perfect alignment, a soothing ritual that helped him manage his anxiety. "Speaking of Riverside," Amanda said, serving herself a generous portion of cranberry sauce, "we just finalized the marketing campaign. The first phase is already 70% pre-sold." "That's our girl," Mom beamed, "always exceeding expectations." "We actually just got back from touring potential sites in Aspen," Brad added, swirling his expensive bourbon. "We're thinking of expanding the Wilson brand to luxury ski properties." "Aspen was divine," Amanda sighed. "We stayed at the Street Regis and did some early Christmas shopping. Jessica, show Grandma those boots we got you." Jessica proudly extended her leg under the table to display what looked like perfectly ordinary boots that probably cost more than a month of Ethan's therapy. "Limited edition," she announced smugly. "Only 20 pairs made." My parents oohed and ahed appropriately, while I focused on helping Ethan navigate the overwhelming array of food options being passed around. He only ate certain foods with specific textures, another aspect of his autism that my family found inconvenient rather than simply a different way of experiencing the world. "Nothing for Ethan again?" my mother noted with a frown as I placed only mashed potatoes and plain turkey on his plate. "He needs to expand his palate, Cletus." Jessica and Jack were eating curry by his age. "Ethan has sensory processing differences," I explained, for what felt like the thousandth time. Certain textures and flavors can be physically uncomfortable for him. Sounds like an excuse for picky eating to me, Brad muttered just loudly enough to be heard. Beneath the table, I felt Ethan begin to rock slightly, a self-soothing motion that helped him regulate when anxiety built up. The movement was barely perceptible, but Jessica immediately noticed and nudged her mother, rolling her eyes. Throughout the meal, the conversation revolved exclusively around Amanda and Brad's business ventures, their children's accomplishments, and vacation properties the family was considering. No one asked about Ethan's recent science fair victory or my business developments. It was as if our lives existed in a parallel universe, visible but not worthy of acknowledgement. Halfway through dinner, I noticed Jessica texting under the table, occasionally showing her phone to Jack and suppressing laughter. From the way her eyes darted toward Ethan, I knew with certainty they were discussing him. When Ethan began quietly humming another self-regulation technique, Brad cleared his throat loudly and gave me a pointed look. "Cletus, perhaps you could address that?" he said, gesturing toward Ethan with his fork. "Address what exactly, Brad?" I asked, keeping my voice deliberately calm. "The humming. It's disruptive to dinner conversation." Before I could respond, Amanda jumped in. "We're just trying to maintain certain standards, Cletus. Is that so wrong?" "Standards," I repeated slowly. "And what standards would those be?" An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Finally, my father spoke, attempting to diffuse the tension. "Let's all enjoy this wonderful meal your mother prepared. Amanda, tell us more about those ski properties." And just like that, the conversation shifted back to safer territory, while Ethan continued to quietly hum, now with his head slightly down, aware on some level that he had done something the family disapproved of. As the dinner progressed, I became increasingly aware of a pattern that had defined my entire life within this family. Any time I had offered business insights like suggesting they invest in tech stocks back in the early 2000s, or warning them against over-leveraging on commercial properties, my advice was dismissed with condescending smiles. "Stick to your computer games, Cletus," Dad had said when I warned him about the housing bubble in 2007. A year later, when the market crashed and they lost millions while my tech investments remained stable, there was no acknowledgement that I had been right. When I developed a proprietary algorithm for predicting real estate market trends and offered it to the family company free of charge, Brad had laughed it off. "Real estate is about instinct and relationships, not computer predictions," he had insisted. That algorithm now formed the backbone of my consulting services to their competitors. Sitting at that Thanksgiving table, watching Jessica whisper and giggle while looking at Ethan, feeling the weight of decades of dismissal and disrespect, I realized nothing would ever change unless I forced it to. They would always see Ethan as defective rather than different. They would always see me as the family failure, rather than recognize my success on my own terms. The familiar weight of disappointment settled on my shoulders as I helped Ethan carefully cut his turkey into precise, equal pieces, exactly how he needed them to be. But beneath that disappointment, something else was brewing, a resolve that had been building for years without my conscious awareness. I just didn't know yet that it would come to a head before dessert was even served. The dining room had grown warmer as dinner progressed. The combination of too many candles, heated conversations about business, and the proximity of too many bodies in formal attire. For most people, this increase in temperature would be barely noticeable, perhaps slightly uncomfortable. For Ethan, with his sensory processing differences, it was becoming overwhelming. I noticed the subtle signs first, the way he began to blink more rapidly, how his fingers twisted the napkin in his lap with increasing urgency, the slight sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the room being objectively comfortable for everyone else. These were his warning signals, the precursors to sensory overload that I had learned to recognize over years of attentive parenting. "Need a quick break, buddy?" I whispered, but Ethan shook his head stubbornly. Despite everything, he wanted to be part of the family gathering, to please his grandparents and be like his cousins. His determination to fit in, despite how unwelcoming they made him feel, broke my heart a little more. When Ethan was focused on managing his sensory input, his motor control sometimes became less precise. His hand moved toward his water glass, but a combination of anxiety and sensory overwhelm caused his arm to jerk slightly. The glass tipped, sending water spreading across the immaculate white tablecloth and dripping onto the antique Persian rug below. The reaction was instantaneous and grossly disproportionate to the minor accident. "Oh my God!" Jessica exclaimed, dramatically pushing her chair back as though a few drops of water might somehow damage her designer outfit. Amanda immediately grabbed cloth napkins, dabbing at the spill with exaggerated movements while shooting pointed looks my way. The entire table fell silent, the kind of weighted silence that made the spilled water seem like a catastrophic disaster rather than the routine accident it was. Brad was the first to break the silence with a comment that made my blood run cold. "This is why we can't have nice things around certain people," he said, not bothering to lower his voice or disguise his meaning. He wasn't looking at Ethan but at his own children, as if providing an instructive moment on the consequences of inadequate parenting. Ethan's face crumpled in shame. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice small and uncertain. "I didn't mean to." Before I could reassure him, Amanda spoke. "Perhaps it would be better if you and Ethan ate in the kitchen, Cletus. There's plenty of room at the breakfast counter, and it would be more suitable for his needs." The suggestion hung in the air, outrageous in its casual cruelty. They wanted to banish us from the family table over spilled water, as though Ethan were not worthy of sitting amongst them, as though we were servants rather than family. I remained outwardly calm, years of practice allowing me to maintain my composure even as rage built inside me. "Ethan stays with me, and we stay at this table," I said quietly but firmly. "It's just water, Amanda. It will dry." "Always making excuses for him," she muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Jessica, emboldened by her mother's attitude, took out her phone and began typing furiously. A moment later, she held the phone to her ear. "You will not believe what just happened," she said loudly into the phone, obviously wanting us to hear. Such an embarrassment. Ethan, already distressed from the spill, began to rock more noticeably, a coping mechanism that helped him process overwhelming emotions. His movements were subtle, a gentle back and forth that wouldn't have been disruptive in any reasonable environment. "Dad," Amanda said sharply, "can't you do something about this situation?" My father cleared his throat uncomfortably, caught between family politics and basic decency. "Cletus, perhaps Ethan does need a little break, just until he's calmer." The fact that my own father would suggest removing his grandson from the family table over behaviors that harmed no one revealed everything about our family dynamic. He had always been weak in the face of Amanda's stronger personality, unwilling to contradict his golden child even when she was clearly wrong. "What Ethan needs," I said with forced evenness, "is for his family to accept him exactly as he is." My mother, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, avoided eye contact with me entirely, suddenly fascinated by rearranging the salt and pepper shakers. Her passive acceptance of cruelty had always been her most defining characteristic. Across the table, I noticed Jack watching the scene unfold with visible discomfort. Unlike his sister, he seemed troubled by the treatment of his cousin. He caught my eye briefly, a flash of what appeared to be apology in his expression, but he quickly looked away, unwilling or unable to stand against his parents and sister. As the tension thickened, I found myself recalling similar scenes from throughout Ethan's life, the family Christmas, when Ethan wasn't included in the gift exchange because he wouldn't appreciate the presents anyway, the summer barbecue where he was relegated to a separate table because his need for specific foods was too much trouble, the countless times I had overheard family members describing him as Cletus's problem child when they thought I couldn't hear. I also remembered my own childhood exclusions being left out of family photos for the company website because I didn't fit the Wilson image. Having my computer science scholarship to MIT dismissed as playing with toys, while Amanda's business school acceptance was celebrated with a party for 200 guests. The way my father introduced me as his other child at business functions. The pattern was so clear, so consistent, and so unlikely to ever change without dramatic intervention. The realization settled over me with surprising clarity. Nothing I could say would ever make them see Ethan or me differently. No amount of patience, explanation, or family loyalty would ever transform them into the supportive family we deserved. Ethan's rocking increased slightly as Jessica continued her performative phone conversation, now describing Ethan as if he were an inconvenience rather than a person. "I have to deal with this every holiday," she complained to whoever was on the other end of the line. "It's like we can't have one normal family gathering." Brad nodded in agreement with his daughter's assessment, adding, "Some people simply don't understand appropriate social behavior." I placed my hand gently on Ethan's back, providing the deep pressure that often helped ground him during stressful situations. "You're doing great, buddy," I whispered. "Nothing to be ashamed of." Amanda snorted at my comment. "That's the problem, isn't it? You never correct his behavior. Jessica and Jack knew how to behave at the table when they were 3, let alone 10. The comparison was so unfair, so fundamentally ignorant of Ethan's neurology, that I found it increasingly difficult to maintain my composed facade. These were not strangers who might be forgiven for their ignorance. These were family members who had been given every opportunity to learn about autism, to understand Ethan's needs, and to adapt in minor ways that would make him feel included. Instead, they had chosen, repeatedly and consistently, to view him as defective, as an embarrassment, as a failure of my parenting rather than a child with different but equally valuable ways of experiencing the world. As the meal continued in strained silence, interrupted only by Jessica's ongoing commentary to her friend, I felt something shift within me. Years of accumulated hurt, disappointment, and anger crystallized into a calm, clear certainty. We deserved better than this. Ethan deserved better than this. And perhaps most importantly, I had the power to ensure we got it. The power they didn't know I possessed financial leverage that could change everything. As dessert approached, I noticed Ethan's breathing had steadied. He had weathered the emotional storm with remarkable resilience, a skill he had been forced to develop far too young. His strength in the face of such casual cruelty made me both immeasurably proud and profoundly sad. What happened next would test that resilience even further, but it would also set in motion a reckoning that had been years in the making. My mother rose to clear the dinner plates, her movements precise and practiced, like everything else she did. "I'll bring out the desserts," she announced with forced brightness, as if the previous tensions could be erased with the promise of pumpkin pie. Ethan perked up immediately. While he had strict preferences about most foods, desserts were his joy, particularly the smooth, consistent texture of pumpkin pie. It was one of the few traditional Thanksgiving dishes he genuinely looked forward to. "Pie time?" he asked me quietly, his eyes brightening with anticipation. "Yes, buddy. Grandma's bringing the pies soon," I assured him, grateful for anything that might improve this disastrous evening. My mother returned with an elaborate dessert cart, showcasing not just the traditional pumpkin pie but also pecan, apple, and chocolate mousse options, along with fresh whipped cream and vanilla ice cream. It was an impressive spread, the kind designed to impress rather than merely satisfy. Jessica's phone conversation had finally ended, but she immediately started a new one, ignoring the family rule about phones at the table, a rule that was apparently only enforced when convenient. "They're still here," she whispered loudly into the phone, making no attempt to disguise her meaning as she glanced toward Ethan and me. Ethan, focused entirely on the approaching dessert cart, didn't notice her comment. His excitement built as my mother began serving, starting predictably with Amanda and Brad, then Jessica and Jack, then my father, before finally approaching our side of the table. "Pie, please," Ethan said, his voice slightly louder than usual due to his excitement. "Pumpkin pie, please." It was a perfectly reasonable request, politely phrased. In any normal family, it would have been met with a smile and immediate fulfillment. But Jessica seized the opportunity to express her disgust with an exaggerated eye roll and an audible, dramatic sigh. And then it happened. As my mother placed a slice of pumpkin pie in front of Ethan, Jessica turned to Jack and clearly mouthed the words, "We don't sit with people like you." The movement of her lips was deliberate, exaggerated, meant to be seen by everyone at the table. And it was. Amanda let out a small, inappropriate laugh. Brad smirked and nodded slightly, as if his daughter had made a particularly astute observation rather than displayed breathtaking cruelty. My father chuckled uncomfortably, caught between his business partner's approval and what must have been some small remaining spark of decency. My mother simply continued serving, her silence a form of complicity that spoke volumes. Jack was the only one who didn't laugh. He looked down at his plate, a flush of what appeared to be shame creeping up his neck. But like everyone else at that table except Ethan and me, he said nothing to contradict the sentiment. In that moment, something extraordinary happened inside my mind. The constant background noise of self-doubt, the question of whether I was overreacting to my family's treatment of us, the wondering if maybe they were right and I was too protective, all of it simply stopped. An absolute silence descended in my thoughts as I processed what had just happened. 15 years of trying to belong in this family, 15 years of making excuses for their behavior, 15 years of telling myself that family connections were worth the constant stream of small cruelties. All of it crystallized into perfect clarity. This pattern would never change unless I forced it to change. Ethan sensed the shift in energy, looking up from his pie with confusion. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked me quietly, always quick to assume responsibility for tension he didn't create. The innocence of his question, the fact that my brilliant, kind, extraordinary son would assume he was at fault rather than the people who should have loved and protected him, made my decision immediate and irrevocable. "No, buddy," I said, my voice remarkably steady. "You did nothing wrong, but we're going to go home now." With calm deliberation, I stood and helped Ethan from his chair. He looked confused but trusted me enough to follow my lead without question. I helped him into his jacket, gathered our belongings, and turned to face my silent family. "Thank you for dinner," I said formally, as if addressing strangers rather than the people who had known me my entire life. "We won't be staying for dessert." "Cletus, don't be dramatic," Amanda began, but I silenced her with a look that must have conveyed the depth of my resolve. "Ethan," I said, turning to my son, "please say goodbye to your grandparents." Ever polite, ever trying to please despite how little he got in return, Ethan dutifully said, "Goodbye, Grandma. Goodbye, Grandpa. Thank you for dinner." My parents looked stunned, as if they couldn't comprehend that their actions might have consequences. "Surely you're not leaving over a little joke," my father said, his voice revealing the first hint of concern not for our feelings, but for the scene we might cause. "It wasn't a joke," I replied simply. "It was cruelty. And we're done with it." As I took Ethan's hand and walked toward the door, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. I checked it as we reached the foyer, away from the stunned faces still seated at the dining table. It was a text from my father. "Payment tomorrow, right?" The audacity was breathtaking. Even now, with the fragments of our relationship scattered across his dining room, his primary concern was the money I had promised. Not an apology, not concern for his grandson's feelings, but confirmation of financial support. I typed a response without hesitation. "Not my problem." 3 simple words that I knew would land like a bomb once their implications became clear. The drive home was quiet, with Ethan falling asleep within minutes, emotionally exhausted from the ordeal. As I navigated the dark roads back to our home, I felt an unexpected sense of peace settling over me. For years, I had carried the weight of trying to belong in a family that fundamentally didn't want us as we were. Putting down that burden felt like taking a full breath for the first time in decades. By the time we pulled into our driveway, Ethan was in deep sleep, his face relaxed and peaceful in a way it hadn't been all evening. I carried him inside and tucked him into bed, brushing his hair back from his forehead and whispering, "I promise things will be different now." As he slept, I sat in our comfortable living room, surrounded by the life we had built together, the specialized sensory equipment that helped Ethan thrive, the technology that facilitated both my business and his education, the photos of our adventures together. This was our real home, our real life. Not the mansion with its cold perfection, but this space filled with understanding and acceptance. My phone began to light up with messages from my family, first confused, then demanding, then increasingly desperate as the implications of my text message sank in. I silenced it without reading more, knowing that tomorrow would bring a reckoning none of them were prepared for. What they didn't know, what they had never bothered to learn, was that the family disappointment they had dismissed for so long was now the only person who could save them from financial ruin. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure I wanted to. The following morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight filtering through the blinds of our modest but comfortable three-bedroom home in the suburbs. It was nothing like my parents' mansion, but it was filled with something their house had always lacked: unconditional acceptance. Ethan was still sleeping, his body recovering from the emotional overload of the previous evening. I moved quietly through our morning routine, preparing his favorite breakfast of plain pancakes cut into perfect triangles, precisely how he preferred them. My phone, which I had silenced the night before, displayed 27 missed calls and 42 text messages when I finally checked it. They ranged from my father's initial confusion, "What do you mean not my problem?" to increasingly desperate pleas as the night progressed. The most recent, sent at 5:32 a.m., revealed just how serious the situation had become. "Cletus, this isn't a game. The company will collapse without that loan. We have payroll to meet on Monday and investors expecting a presentation. Call me immediately." I scrolled through the others, noting the progression from annoyance to panic. "Amanda, stop being childish. Jessica is just a teenager. Come back and act like an adult." "Brad, your father needs that transfer today. Whatever your issues, don't punish the whole family." "Mom, after everything we've done for you and Ethan, this is how you repay us? Your father hasn't slept all night." The lack of apology, the absence of any recognition of what had actually transpired, was telling. Even now, faced with serious consequences, they viewed the situation entirely through the lens of how it affected them, not how their behavior had affected Ethan. I had just set Ethan's breakfast on the table when my father called again. After a moment's consideration, I answered. "Finally," he exclaimed, foregoing any greeting. "Cletus, I need you to make that transfer immediately. The bank is calling us hourly, and we have a meeting with investors at 2. Without that cash infusion, we're looking at potential bankruptcy." "Good morning to you too, Dad," I replied calmly. "Is there something else you wanted to say to me? Perhaps about last night?" There was a momentary pause, followed by an exasperated sigh. "Look, if Jessica hurt your feelings with some teenage comment, I'm sure she's sorry, but this is serious business, son. This is the family legacy at stake." "Is she sorry?" I asked. "Because I haven't heard that from her, or from you, or from anyone else who sat at that table and laughed while my son was humiliated." Another pause, longer this time. "Cletus, I'm talking about the company your grandfather built, that your mother and I expanded, that will someday belong to Ethan too. Are you really going to risk all that over a misunderstanding?" His framing was so fundamentally dishonest that I almost laughed. "It wasn't a misunderstanding, Dad. It was the culmination of years of disrespect toward Ethan and me. And as for the company someday belonging to Ethan, we both know that's not true. You, Amanda, and Brad have made it abundantly clear that Ethan isn't considered a legitimate heir to anything." "That's not fair," he protested weakly. "What's not fair," I countered, "is treating your grandson like an embarrassment because his brain works differently than yours. What's not fair is allowing your granddaughter to openly mock him without consequence. What's not fair is caring more about a bank transfer than the damage you've done." "What do you want from me, Cletus?" he asked, a rare note of defeat in his voice. "I want what I've always wanted, respect and acceptance for Ethan and me. But I've realized I can't make you give that to us. What I can do is remove us from situations where we're treated as less than." "And the loan?" he pressed, ever focused on the bottom line. "I'll need time to think," I replied. "I suggest you start making alternate arrangements." I ended the call and blocked the number temporarily, needing space to process without the constant interruptions. I did the same with Amanda, Brad, and my mother, leaving only Jack's number unblocked, having sensed something different in him. As if on cue, a text came through from Jack. "Uncle Cletus, I'm really sorry about what happened last night. I should have said something when Jessica was being mean. Ethan doesn't deserve to be treated that way. I feel terrible." His message, the only one containing a genuine apology, touched me. I replied briefly, "Thank you, Jack. That means a lot. Ethan and I are okay." With the family crisis temporarily muted, I focused on giving Ethan the perfect Saturday. When he woke, I suggested we visit the Museum of Science. his favorite place in Boston. His face lit up immediately. "Can we see the electricity show?" he asked, referring to the Tesla coil demonstration that fascinated him. "Absolutely," I promised. "And anything else you want to see?" The day that followed was everything Thanksgiving should have been but wasn't: relaxed, joyful, accepting. We explored the museum's exhibits at Ethan's pace, lingering at the engineering stations where his problem-solving abilities shined. We had lunch at the museum cafe, where they knew us well enough to prepare Ethan's grilled cheese exactly as he liked it. We watched the electricity show not once but twice, because Ethan's enthusiasm was so evident that the presenter invited him to stay for a second demonstration. Not once did I check my phone. Not once did I allow the family drama to intrude on our perfect day together. For those precious hours, nothing existed beyond Ethan's happiness and our shared exploration. It was early evening when we returned home, Ethan chattering excitedly about the properties of electrical conductivity. As I prepared a simple dinner, the local news played quietly in the background. A familiar name caught my attention. Wilson Real Estate Developments faces questions from investors amid rumors of financial instability, the newscaster announced. Sources close to the company suggest a major deal fell through last week, potentially leaving the firm overextended on several high-profile developments. The news was moving faster than I had anticipated. Word of their financial troubles had leaked to the media, which would only increase the pressure they were facing. After Ethan was in bed, I finally allowed myself to consider the full scope of the situation and my response to it. For years, I had allowed my family to treat us as less than, while simultaneously building my own success in the background. The security systems I had developed were now used by major corporations worldwide, generating substantial recurring revenue. My net worth, conservatively estimated, exceeded $20 million, likely more than my parents and sister combined, especially given their current financial troubles. I had never flaunted my wealth, partly because I had no interest in the status symbols that obsessed my family, and partly because I enjoyed the freedom of being underestimated. But perhaps it was time to reveal the truth, not to boast, but to reset the power dynamic that had allowed them to treat us so poorly for so long. I spent the night drafting an email to my entire family, choosing my words carefully. By morning, I had a message that expressed exactly what I wanted to convey. To all Wilson family members, yesterday's events have forced me to reevaluate our family relationships. For years, Ethan and I have accepted treatment that no one should tolerate from strangers, let alone family. This stops now. If there is to be any relationship between us moving forward, these conditions are non-negotiable. 1. Respect for Ethan exactly as he is, not as you wish he would be. Not as a problem to be managed, but as a complete person worthy of the same dignity afforded to every other member of this family. 2. A formal apology from each person who participated in or silently condoned yesterday's behavior. 3. Family counseling with a specialist in autism acceptance, with genuine participation from everyone. As for the financial situation, I'm aware the company needs immediate assistance to avoid bankruptcy. Before any discussion of financial support can occur, the above conditions must be met. For complete transparency, I've attached a screenshot of my current investment portfolio and net worth statement. Perhaps now you'll understand why I found it particularly ironic when you suggested Ethan and I needed your financial support, rather than the other way around. I've decided to reevaluate all family relationships, including financial ones. I'll be available to discuss this further once you've had time to process. Cletus. I attached the financial documentation showing my net worth of just over $22 million, with the subject line, Family Values. After sending the email, I took Ethan to the park, leaving my phone at home. Whatever explosion resulted from my message, I wanted us to be beyond its immediate blast radius. When we returned hours later, my voicemail was full, and my email inbox had exploded. Most surprising was a message from my father's personal assistant, informing me that an emergency family meeting had been called at the mansion for 5 p.m., with my attendance urgently requested. The tone had shifted dramatically from demanding to pleading, from dismissive to desperate. The single message about reevaluating financial relationships had indeed turned their laughter into panic, just as I had known it would. What I hadn't fully anticipated was how empowering it would feel to finally set boundaries that could not be ignored. For the first time in my adult life, I was defining the terms of my family relationships rather than constantly adjusting to accommodate their disrespect. As Ethan and I prepared for an evening at home with movies and his favorite pizza, I realized that I wasn't anxious about missing the emergency family meeting. Their emergency was not our emergency. Their panic was not our panic. We were, at long last, free from the exhausting cycle of seeking approval that would never come on terms that respected who we truly were. 3 months passed, bringing with them the first hints of spring in Boston. The bare trees outside our kitchen window showed tiny buds, promising renewal after a particularly harsh winter. The weather wasn't the only thing that had undergone a transformation since that fateful Thanksgiving day. The Wilson family dynamics had shifted so dramatically that sometimes it felt like I was living in an alternate reality. The changes began within days of my revealing email, as the full extent of the company's financial troubles became public. Without my loan, they had been unable to meet several critical obligations, sending shockwaves through Boston's real estate community. The Wilson real estate development stock had plummeted, wiping out millions in family wealth overnight. My father, facing the real possibility of losing everything, had finally called me with something resembling genuine humility. "We need to talk," he had said simply, without demands or accusations. That conversation led to a series of negotiations that resulted in a fundamental restructuring of both the family business and our personal relationships. I had agreed to provide the necessary capital to stabilize the company, but only as an investment with specific conditions, not as a gift or loan. Those conditions included not just financial terms, but personal ones as well. I now held a 30% ownership stake in Wilson Real Estate Developments, making me the second largest shareholder after my parents. More importantly, I had secured positions on both the family trust and company board, ensuring Ethan's future interests would be protected regardless of his capabilities or choices. But the most meaningful changes weren't financial. They were personal. Jessica, my niece whose cruel words had been the catalyst for everything, was now spending 10 hours every week volunteering at an autism support center as part of our agreement. Initially resentful, she had gradually developed genuine relationships with several of the children there, including a girl her age with similar interests in fashion and music. Last week, she had surprised everyone by inviting this new friend to join her and her regular friend group for a movie night. Amanda and Brad, who had come perilously close to losing not just their livelihoods but their lavish lifestyle, had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation. The humbling experience of nearly losing everything, combined with mandatory family therapy sessions, had cracked their perfect facade. During our third session, Amanda had broken down completely, admitting that her hostility toward Ethan stemmed partly from fear that her own children might someday be diagnosed with something she didn't understand, fear that she wouldn't be strong enough to handle it as I had. "You make it look so easy," she had confessed through tears. "You never complain, you never give up, you just keep going and loving him exactly as he is." It made me feel inadequate somehow. Her admission had opened the door to a level of honesty we had never achieved in 37 years as siblings. For the first time, we were communicating as adults with shared experiences rather than competitors for our parents' approval. My parents, too, had been forced to reckon with their choices. My mother had taken the initiative to convert one room of their mansion into a sensory-friendly space for Ethan, complete with adjustable lighting, comfortable seating, and activities he enjoyed. She had consulted with specialists and asked for my input every step of the way, showing a level of interest in his needs that I had previously thought impossible. My father had been slower to change, his pride making it difficult to admit his mistakes. But even he had made progress, taking time each week to engage with Ethan in activities they could enjoy together. They had developed a shared interest in model trains, with my father showing surprising patience as Ethan meticulously arranged the tracks according to his precise vision. Perhaps most surprising was Jack's transformation. My nephew had emerged from his sister's shadow, showing genuine leadership within the family. He had been the first to complete the autism awareness training I had required, the first to apologize sincerely to Ethan, and the first to make real changes in how he interacted with his cousin. They had developed a true friendship, with Jack discovering that Ethan's different perspective often led to insights and observations he would never have considered. As for Ethan, he had flourished under the newfound respect and accommodation. His confidence had grown, his anxiety reduced. He still had challenges, as any child with autism does, but he now moved through family gatherings with the security of knowing he would be accepted rather than merely tolerated. The journey hadn't been easy or straightforward. There had been setbacks and relapses into old patterns. Family therapy had revealed generational wounds that went far deeper than I had realized. My father's relentless drive for success, it turned out, stemmed from his own father's constant criticism. My mother's emotional distance was a coping mechanism developed in childhood. Understanding these patterns didn't excuse their behavior toward Ethan, but it helped explain it, making reconciliation possible where before it had seemed impossible. I had learned important lessons, too. For years, I had enabled their disrespect by accepting it silently, by making excuses for behavior that should never have been excused. I had allowed my own desire for family connection to override my responsibility to protect Ethan from emotional harm. My failure to establish boundaries earlier had tacitly given permission for the very behavior I resented. The most profound realization was that what they had always seen as my biggest failure, choosing a different path than the one they had prescribed, had become my greatest strength. My computer hobby had built a fortune that ultimately saved the family business. My stubborn insistence on accommodating Ethan's needs had created a model for the kind of acceptance all families should practice. The peace that came from no longer seeking approval was more valuable than any financial success. The freedom of authenticity over performance, of boundaries over perpetual accommodation, had transformed not just our family relationships but my relationship with myself. 6 months after Thanksgiving, we gathered again for a family dinner, this one at Amanda and Brad's home. The contrast with our previous gathering could not have been more stark. Ethan was seated in the place of honor next to his cousins, his specific food preferences thoughtfully accommodated without comment. The lighting was adjusted to his comfort level, background music kept at a volume that wouldn't overwhelm him. Jessica even made a point of asking him about his latest programming project, showing genuine interest in his detailed explanation. As I watched my son being celebrated rather than merely tolerated, I felt a bittersweet satisfaction. The change was real and meaningful, but it had required financial leverage to achieve what should have come from love alone. In an ideal world, respect shouldn't require the threat of consequences to maintain. Acceptance shouldn't depend on financial power. But we lived in the real world, with real, flawed people who sometimes needed dramatic wake-up calls to recognize the damage they were causing. The true test would be whether these changes endured once the initial crisis had passed, whether the lessons learned in desperation would transform into genuine values. Only time would tell, but I was cautiously optimistic. Some wounds had begun to heal, some bridges carefully rebuilt. What I knew with absolute certainty was that I would never again allow anyone, family or not, to make Ethan feel less worthy because of who he was. I would never again sacrifice his well-being or my self-respect at the altar of family harmony. Sometimes walking away, even temporarily, is the only way to create the possibility of a healthier return. The greatest gift I could give my son wasn't financial security or family connections, it was modeling the courage to demand respect, to choose challenging authenticity over comfortable pretense, and to recognize that those who truly love you will see your differences not as flaws to be tolerated, but as essential elements of who you are. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relationships to protect yourself or someone you love? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more stories about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Share this with someone who might need to be reminded of their worth today. Thank you for listening. And remember, teaching people how to treat you and your loved ones is sometimes the most important lesson you'll ever deliver.